This is the third and this is the third and last video of the Betty story, and we are going to be looking at the question of Dorothy, who seems to be a bit of the come by lately daughter. So just to refresh, Dorothy had been living on the West Coast. She had some pension problems and her job was also in peril. And so she reaches out and offers to move back in and move in with mother, Betty, in exchange for room, board, and of course a wage. So this will be a new job for her, but seems like a good option, particularly when Betty is becoming increasingly forgetful, and we're still a little uncertain as to what's going to happen with Al. So if Al moves back, there may be increased needs for care as well, although that doesn't seem to be discussed in the arrangement. So how does it all go? Well, Dorothy moves in with Betty, and expectations are high. This is often called a private care agreement and is very rarely documented in contract, despite the fact that this is actually going to be a job that she has. But I suspect that it's probably done quite informally. As Dorothy comes back, this private care agreement seems to not be working out quite so well. When it comes to cooking, Dorothy is wanting to cook vegan, which is not what Betty is hoping for. And her answer is not to prepare Betty extra separate meals, but rather to sign her up for Meals on Wheels, which I think would have been a disappointing response and perhaps not what was expected when it was determined that she would move in and provide care and indeed get a wage for doing that. So that's concerning. We also see that Dorothy starts agitating around the company. So the company is paying, I think, some types of dividends and probably salary to Ross. And she starts wondering how it is that Ross is making all this money, and assuredly why Dorothy herself is not making money, despite the fact that Dorothy has not worked for the business. So there should be some red flags around financial elder exploitation raising up here. On the other hand, Dorothy may have some serious questions. She starts questioning how it is that Ross has a posh lifestyle, and for all it could be possible that Ross might be acting inappropriately and taking more money than he should. We don't know, but you know, either there's some red flags that Dorothy is asking questions and putting her nose in places out of some sense of jealousy, or I suppose it could be that Dorothy is asking real questions and indeed trying to protect her mother's interest, but it doesn't perhaps seem that way. Dorothy also is wanting a number of expenditures. Now, contrast this against when Betty wanted to make significant expenditures to accommodate Al in the home. So this is sort of a different feeling, though, isn't it? So Dorothy is starting to say that she should have a special new car, which she figures will somehow benefit Betty, and that there should also be new hardwood floors, new windows, new home renovation, new appliances. So I guess the question is, are they doing this because, Dorothy wants to live in a nicer place? Are they doing this because they're thinking about updating it and it really would be a pleasure for Betty to have updated? You see that they're spending time looking at home improvement shows. And maybe Betty does want to spend her money on improving the home. Alternatively, maybe it's Dorothy's way of trying to embellish her own particular life and to live better. So there's some questions there. We see that Ross is now disagreeing, saying that their mother wants to remain living in her home. She would need the money to pay for care. So we see that this is a tension of the power of attorney for property, which is Ross, and the claims of Dorothy, who doesn't seem to have, at this point, a power of attorney against the issue. So we're seeing that Ross is executing, probably good judgment and saying that, his mother needs care and there's going to be expenditures and that maybe it's too much. So it's quite an appropriate set of responses. But contrast that, if you will, from the set of responses that Carl gave when he was acting as financial power of attorney and when Betty wanted to have it. So, it's sort of easy to read the Carl situation as, oh, Carl is acting very badly and poor Betty. And then it's very easy to read the Dorothy situation and say, oh, Ross is acting wrongly and poor, sorry, my apologies. It's really easy to say that Dorothy is looking like a grasping person, and that Ross is acting rightly, but really we don't know enough about it. So it's easy to smell, a bit of a fink on the Dorothy one, and it's easy to be concerned with regards to the similar situation when Carl doesn't want to improve Betty's house. But what we need to do is learn more. So not to jump to conclusions. Um, what we see, however, is Dorothy taking it to the next step, which does red flags with me. It does make me worry about that. So Dorothy's consulting the lawyer as to why Betty couldn't have what she wanted. It was her money after all. And the lawyer told Dorothy that if Betty wasn't happy with Ross looking after her money, she could change her power of attorney. So we know that Betty is getting forgetful, so we should be wondering whether Betty has the power to, in fact, execute a power of attorney. Having said that, there's always the presumption that the person is capable unless proven otherwise. So Betty does go to the same lawyer, so it shows some continuity. Um, but it is concerning because it may not be clear to the lawyer on whose particular instructions that they are acting upon. It's very important for the lawyer to act only on one client's instructions. And I guess I have a question as to whether or not this lawyer is somehow jointly acting for Dorothy as well as for Betty. When asked whether she wanted to do, Betty said she wanted to live in peace, and yes, she wanted her house to be fixed up if that's what Dorothy wanted. Well, that is a concerning response. So to live in peace does not say that you want to change your attorney. It does not say that you want to revoke your son's, power of attorney, and I question whether or not those are actually capable instructions. Um, the lawyer draws up the power of attorney for Betty and appoints Dorothy. That is concerning to me. So, is there some form of undue influence going on there? Is there some type of mental capacity issue going on there? Of all of the things that is most clear, that's certainly the most concerning. So, on a go forward basis, what we know is because there is a new power of attorney in effect, this will have automatically, really, essentially revoke the previous power of attorney to the degree that they coincide with each other. You can have two powers of attorney as long as they don't bump into each other. So if you had one power of attorney for your property in Florida and another power of attorney for all of your stuff in Ontario, those don't bump into each other. If you have one power of attorney for one bank account exclusively and a general power of attorney more broadly on a continuing basis for all of your other assets, those may not bump into each other. In this particular case, it looks like they would bump into each other and indeed be revoking the previous power of attorney. So you can imagine how Ross is going to react to this particular circumstance. And I would be quite concerned that Dorothy doesn't seem to actually be working with the best interest at heart. And she may not be able to fully grasp either the care needs of her mother, or she may be looking much more likely to start extracting control from Ross and herself taking over control. So, at the end of this scenario, by having a new power of attorney, it's pretty clear that Ross will be revoked as the power of attorney, that Dorothy will be put in place. But we're concerned about whether or not there was capacity. Certainly, there was no instructions to be able to say that she wanted to live in peace and she wanted her house to be fixed up. If that's what Dorothy wanted, is not appropriate instructions, and I think it would be quite inappropriate for the lawyer to have taken instructions on that count. So there's questions about whether or not the second power of attorney is in fact valid at all. I would suggest to you it is probably not. And that wraps up the questions of Betty's story. What I hope to show by using this as a scenario is the complexities of powers of attorney, the complexities of whether or not you're acting in your own self-dealing or whether or not you're acting according to the values, wishes, and beliefs of the other person, as well as the challenges of weighing out, the values, wishes, and beliefs of somebody as to whether or not they can actually afford to do it. So in this particular case, you see that Ross may be quite right. He may not be able to afford to spend all that money and still pay for care. But contrast that against the scenario with Carl, who looked like a very unsympathetic character. But if we knew more, perhaps Carl was working in just a badly framed set of activities against his mother-in-law. Pardon me, his mother's stepmother. Pardon me. in this particular area. So that wraps it up. I hope that Betty's story was useful to you, and we'll move on to our next materials.